there's a reason this discourse is happening on Twitter, right? That's where discourse happens, right? That's where
I don't know if it's discourse, but
Twitter is just like the outrage fountain that you can go get a sip from if you want to walk away kind of upset.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 428 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's August 11th, 20 Jubilee.
August 11th.
August 11th. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show, so, it's exciting, and get ready for that. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscosh.net. Thank you so much for your donations every month. We're grabbing your money, and we like it. Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about the thing that everybody's talking about this week, which is Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah.
Okay. I honestly wasn't planning on playing it. Not for any particular reason, just time, But then so many people were talking about it that I was like, I have to make time. I have to make time for this because I think it's important.
Yeah.
And first you have to make time to download it because it's
120 fucking gigabytes.
It literally took up half of the remaining space on my machine.
I had to put it on my second hard drive because I was like, I always had like 100 gigs free, as a safety buffer. It wasn't enough on my main drive. I had to install it on my second drive. It's a big game. And I mean that not just in gigabytes sense, but just like, let's talk about this. All right. So it's a game made by Larian Studios, who made Divinity Original Sin, that set of games, which are fantastic games as well.
And these are really heavy RPGs where it's like the closest thing to kind of a tabletop Dungeons and Dragons experience that you're going to get, even their previous games, right? It's very, very
really classic RPG.
Yeah. When you think about like a hard RPG, this is basically what that is. Your same classes, sort of a vibe. Whole thing's about storytelling and your choices and what your sort of skills open up for you in terms of how you can interact with the environment and all that sort of stuff. And I think what's been interesting because I had this similar response where I hadn't planned on playing it because I had played Divinity Original Sin 2, and it was struck me in a place where I was like, I could take it or leave it, sort of a thing. It was very cool. Don't get me wrong. And if you're a fan of RPGs, it's 100% going to be for you. But I found the combat a bit too slow and a little annoying. However, similarly, I saw these people talking about it and people wouldn't stop talking about it. And then these little stories kept coming up from people, just the weird shit that had happened to them in this game. And it just seemed to be this fountain of remarkable things, basically. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, I mean.
Well, okay, and that you would have like two people who have each played the game for, 5 hours or something. Mm-hmm. And they're both talking to each other about what they've seen. And neither of them have seen any of the same things.
Yes.
Like it's because it's story driven and it's all about like player choices and like where you go, who you talk to, the order in which you do things, whether you like agree or disagree with this person or kill this person or save this person or whatever. And it actually does affect everything going forward. To the point where, you're just not going to have the same experience as any other person playing the game. There'll be overlaps, obviously. You'll see some of the same things, but you're not going to see all the same things. And it leads to these really interesting conversations where people are constantly discovering things about the game just by talking to each other about what they've seen and what they've done and why they've done it,
Yeah, so it's a really, I think, especially a really good game in the age of social media stuff or just like the level of connectivity we have now, right? Because when you have this scenario where people are sharing their stories like, oh, here's what happened on my playthrough or in my play session today. And then other people who might be in the same spot can see that and have a conversation now, but like, oh, well, I actually did this and this happened. I think it's the sort of game that's structured to naturally produce a lot of commentary, right? About itself because of its sort of inherently remarkable nature. And then the fact that when people share something about it, it's not just like, oh yeah, I saw that. That was crazy. It was like I didn't see that. I saw this other crazy thing. And then it's like, what, So I think it produces a lot of chatter just sort of by its nature. And
I think it's just the sheer amount of surprise, right?
It's constant novelty, basically.
Yeah. It's stuff where you'd think there's no way that they anticipated me doing this thing I'm about to do.
Yes.
And then you do it, and then the game, and then some character comes running up, and they're like, I saw you do that thing.
Yep.
I've been waiting for somebody to do that thing for you. You know, and then there's like a whole storyline, and you're like, no fucking way. No way that they saw this.
Well, I think the easiest way to, if you're not like a person who maybe plays RPGs or whatever else, to get a glimpse of the scale of this game is simply to say that the game, like many games that take place in an environment, has lots of animals in it. Okay. That's not particularly unusual, whatever.
Little rats, dogs,
Except
rabbits, critters.
every animal is fully voiced, as in you can talk
You can use
to
you
them.
can use a spell to be able to talk to animals.
And not just animals, but every one of them.
Every single animal.
And they have something to say. And some of them, I apparently intruded on a squirrel's territory, and it bit me on the foot. And then I had to intimidate it and be like, look, you little shit. If you don't leave me alone, I'm going to tell everybody how nice this patch of trees is. And it was like, all right, I'll give you a pass. You can walk through here and I won't harass you. And I was like, what is happening? What is happening?
Well, and there's also there's a scroll of talking to the dead or a spell or whatever, which I don't know if you've done that yet. But like at one point I came across one of these scrolls, and there was a character who I had like helped out and done some favors for early in the game, right? Who is actually not a very good person, but I was like, I'm going to save this person and just see what happens. And much, much later, I find that character dead because they've returned back to some like warlord or whatever,
nice.
and they got killed. And so I was like, huh. So I used my scroll of talking to dead people, you know, and I start talking to the body of this person, and I'm able to ask them questions about like what happened to them and blah, blah. And it's all fully voiced. And there's like a whole cut scene with like my eyes glowing and the character's eyes glowing, you know, and all this stuff. And it's just like it's all in there. Like everything where you're like, I wonder.
Yeah.
And yep, it's in there.
I think that's an easy way to glimpse the scale of this thing, right? Where every animal is fully voiced and might have a quest for you is kind of fucking wild, right?
Or every
dead body. Yeah.
You could talk, like if you've got the magic, you can talk to any dead body you come across, and they will have voice lines and they'll have conversational options. What?
So there's a reason why it takes up half your hard drive, right? But
I can't believe it's only 120 gigabytes.
It's probably
mainly
mostly
voice.
audio. Yeah.
Yep, it's always mostly audio. But I think what has kind of come out of this on the other side is, one, the game's been just sort of exploding, right? Because again, it's naturally easy to talk about. It's very remarkable. It's very well done. The combat is way better than the Divinity Original Sin combat, in my opinion. So it's
a little more streamlined and intuitive.
It's a little more interesting.
It still has a shit ton of options, but it is a turn-based game, which means like, you know, I have a mage character who has like, you know, 12 normal abilities plus like 29 spells plus every item in their bag, right? But it's turn-based, so
you could take a moment.
You know, when it's their turn to do stuff, I can just sit there and be like, what do I want to do? You know, which in a D&D, so this is a D&D game, by the way, like the IP Baldur's Gate, like this is a Dungeons and Dragons thing. And like, if you ever played Dungeons and Dragons in real life, you know that like the turn-based aspect actually sucks a lot because, you know, you have to just wait for people to sit there and like think through all their possible options and look through their character sheet. What can I do? How many spell slots do I, you know, all that stuff.
And you also feel the pressure when it's your turn, right? Because
you're trying to go fast, right?
Buddy.
But like this is a great sort of counterpoint to that. Where like in Baldur's Gate 3, it's a video game and you can play it as single player, and so nobody's waiting for you, right? So you can just take your time and read through the tool tips and try to think strategically and all of that stuff.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot going on. But I think what's interesting about it has been a bit of this online discourse that's come out of it from the dev side of things. So again, players are loving this thing and it's humongous. I mean, most developers are loving this thing too. But Seth, I think you have some of more of the details on kind of this interesting thread of discussion that's cropped up through social media from developers in the industry with concerns about Baldur's Gate.
So I will preface this by saying this happened on Twitter, which means it's already going to be a subset of developers who tweet, which is a specific group of people that doesn't necessarily represent the developer community at large. But it's an interesting conversation nonetheless. So it's a Twitter thread started by Zalavier Nelson Jr. I don't know if I'm saying that first name correctly. It's a very interesting first name. by Strange Scaffold Games. So that's the studio who made Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator.
Sounds pretty good.
Which I'm interested, honestly. But basically the thread was saying that it was just expressing some admiration for Baldur's Gate 3, but also concern about the idea that players going forward would start to expect this volume of content and this level of polish from everything, and that Baldur's Gate 3 is an anomaly and that you shouldn't really take this as like a new standard for games.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of back and forth about it.
Which is like just a true statement, right?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's that every development studio has their own set of constraints, right? And it's like if you have like a 10-person indie studio, you could not possibly expect them to make something at the scale of Baldur's Gate 3, right? Yeah. So even when we saw like when No Man's Sky came out, which is from Hello Games, which is 12 people, right? Mm-hmm. And it looked like a small team delivering a game of immense scale, right? But what actually happened was none of the content is authored. It's procedural, right? So they spent a long time like working on procedural algorithms. And when the game launched, people realized like, oh, there's not a lot of actual stuff here. It's like, it looks like there's a lot of stuff, but it's like you go to each planet you go to, there's no difference in planets.
Yeah, it's the same deal as also original Crashlands versus Crashlands 2, right? It's a procedural versus authored content where you can fill out a seemingly large game space procedurally. And that could take you pretty far, right? But the amount of effort required to fill up that same volume with authored content is just not. It's just
scale.
It's just such a different scale.
Yeah. And so basically, then what happened with Larian is they made Divinity Original Sin, Divinity Original Sin 2. And then starting in 2017, they started work on Baldur's Gate 3 using the engine and tech from Divinity Original Sin 2. So all they needed to do was expand the capabilities of the engine or adapt it to the specifics of the design of this new game. And much of that 6 years was just straight up content development, right? Like they had about 400 developers in 7 offices working for 6 years. It was in early access for 3 years. So half of its development was early access where they were just doing tons and tons of community feedback and all this stuff. And of course it's using the Dungeons and Dragons IP. So they have that sort of like
it's an established
that well of like lore and content and community to draw from. And so, the quality of the game, the scale of the game, the level of success, like all this stuff is anomalous, right? But also in my mind, like this is the exact kind of thing that we should expect from this studio.
Yes.
Like
it's anomalous in the industry, right? But it would be a problem if the studio didn't pull off something of this quality and scale.
Yeah. And so to me, this always comes back to the nail it or whiff it, right? Which is like, it's not about, it's not like, oh, wow, every game should be Baldur's Gate 3. No, I don't want that. I want variety of games.
No one expects that also. I think
I want
that's
action
the weirdest
games.
thing
I
to me
want
about
RTSs. Yeah, like their games are all totally different from each other, and they're made under different constraints. They have different styles, and also like with Baldur's Gate 3, my plan is like I want to play through it. I want to finish the story, and then probably like in 3 years I'll play through it again. Because that's like what I did with Dragon Age Origins and that kind of thing. So like I'm going to engage with this game very differently than I engage with like World of Warcraft, which is a social game for me and has totally different expectations, right? So anyway, so this Twitter thread was kind of so it ended up with almost 500 replies from lots of other developers. In some cases pushing back, in other cases expressing similar apprehension about they don't want people to think that the game that they're working on is shit because it doesn't measure up to what Baldur's Gate 3 does. And I think it's an unfounded concern. Like
I think it's completely unfounded.
And however founded it may be, like Baldur's Gate isn't the best game of all time, so it made this now be a problem, right? This is like there's always has been and always will be a huge discrepancy between studios that have been around for a long time and then of those that have invested continuously in their game engine and their approach to making games and all that kind of stuff so that they can make bigger and bigger and better stuff over time. And newcomers and people who have different studio shapes. What's gonna like? There's always gonna be this huge variety of how games are made and what they look like when they come out the other side. And it may be fair that this sets a new benchmark in some of those dimensions. Like that's possible about like what the maximum could look like, right? But that's just happening every year. Every year, some game pushes a benchmark up. That it just extends the range of of like what we now see as possible, right? But, yeah.
It's like a 4-minute mile, right? Where like nobody had run a 4-minute mile and everybody thought it was not physically possible. And then as soon as one person did it, like 20 other people did it within a few months afterwards, because people are like, oh shit, like, oh, that's a thing you can do, right? And I feel like Baldur's Gate 3 is that, where it's kind of
but most people still can't, right? Yeah.
Most people still can't, but also that it's possible, which changes your thinking. It changes your thinking about, okay, well, given that somebody's done it, they've made a game. Yeah, how did they do it? And if we look at their processes and try to sort of emulate some of the ideas that they have for how to make games, then can we make a game with our small studio? Can we make a game that's actually like way more stable and way bigger than what we would ordinarily have been able to do, by just changing our approach a little bit? And I think this also kind of, comes off the heels of stuff like Cyberpunk, where you've got a huge game with tons of hype and promise that was supposed to be sort of Baldur's Gate 3 like in the sense that it's an RPG with tons of character choice and stories and stuff. But their development practices were frankly not good, right? And they launched the thing just in a horribly buggy state.
With a wake of developer bodies in the midst,
Yeah, they just crunched nonstop forever. And
this will keep happening because so much of this business is run by business people. That's the approach that they take is, they burn all resources in the process of trying to make a thing. And it's very quarter by quarter looking rather than looking at the next decade, right? So like this is just what games are going to keep looking like. Like nothing has actually changed here.
Nothing's really going to change here, but it's I think Baldur's Gate 3, is going to serve as an inspiration point for a lot of things. Us included. I mean, it's already the case that like as we've been playing through it over this past week and we've been designing story and narrative and encounters in Crashlands 2, there's been probably half of our conversations now have been like, well, here's something that they did in Baldur's Gate that was kind of interesting. How did they do that? And can we sort of like pull ideas from that, concept and put our own spin on that kind of a thing, And so it's just like it's serving as a really nice touch point for design and inspiration and again, like it's showing us what's possible, right?
Yeah.
Is Crashlands 2 gonna be the scale of Baldur's Gate 3? No.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. That would be insane.
What is so weird
but it is gonna be a huge, immersive, complete, and super fun game experience, which is what people want.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
But this is one thing I do want to lock into a little bit, because what is so strange to me about that line of reasoning or that whole thread and the sheer number of people on it, that are in agreement with it is that it feels like because the actuality is it's essentially someone saying, look, this game is so amazing that it essentially scares me a little bit. That's essentially what's happening. It scares me a little bit how amazing this game is because I can't see how I or the studio I'm in or whatever else could produce anything like this, right? And that's fine, to be a little worried about that, but it feels in a variety of ways a little narrow in terms of the scope of that vision or that statement, because simultaneously with Baldur's Gate 3 is blowing up, right? You had a game called Vampire Survivors that came out last November, which is some pixel art, some fucking just basic gameplay loops that are very well executed that just absolutely blew up and everybody was playing and talking about it for a while.
And same thing with this, but it's this Battle Bit remastered.
Yep.
It's just absolutely crushing Steam charts right now, and it has been for like a month and a half or two
since it came out. Yeah, it's just
and it's just like a blocky ass pixely indie game looking thing, but it's great.
It's great. But I think what's been so weird to me looking at that conversational thread and stuff is basically it feels like it's missing, I don't know, the rest of the industry, because it's like when you look at something like Vampire Survivors, it's not like, most devs who look at it are like, I could build that, which is that is mostly true. You didn't, but you probably could, because it's not
It was like when
systems on
Flappy
systems.
Bird came out, right? Like
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like there's a wide variety of ways to be extremely successful, right? Extremely successful.
It's all about nailing it.
Yeah.
Did you nail it? If so, you'll be fine.
Yeah. So
well, it's about nailing it and then luck, right? It's
Nailing
still-
it. Oh yeah. Did you nail it? And is what you nailed something that people actually want? You know.
That's what I think is so odd about it. Because I'm like, to me, that means that you can just delete all the weird fear stuff out of it and just give praise to Baldur's Gate for being giant and amazing. Because there are tons of other
honestly,
games more successful than yours. Always.
But also think back, like World of Warcraft was made in 2004. So it's been almost 20 years. Or it was launched in 2004. It started development in 2000, I think. So more than 20 years ago, Blizzard started working on this game. Today, could our studio make a game with all the tech progression that's happened in this time? Could our studio make a game comparable in scope to that game as it launched in 2004? No,
Absolutely not.
right? Like it's always the case that there are games that are coming out that only that studio or very few studios would ever have a hope of having the resources, the time, the sheer manpower, the expertise, all that stuff to actually deliver on. And really it's to me, it's just more of a question of what should we be expecting from a given studio, right? And so like Starfield is coming up, a new Bethesda game, right? And Bethesda, they made Skyrim and Fallout and Elder Scrolls and Oblivion and like all that stuff, right? So they have a reputation for making good RPGs, but also they have a more recent reputation for doing a lot of weird shit and having extremely buggy products, right? And so it's not.
Well, they've always had a reputation for buggy products, but in a way where it was like kind of funny, so people weren't mad about it exactly.
I think it was assumed to be basically a side effect of the scale that they were operating.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, which is like this
then you see
game's so
Baldur's Gate
big.
3 and it's like, oh, it turns out you can actually have good QA and a big studio. Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Wow. Yep.
Yeah. So Starfield is coming out and there's been a lot of sort of like chatter online of people hyped about Starfield, which is Bethesda's new RPG. It's a space. It's a full new IP. So it's not connected to anything that they've done in the past. But it is an RPG set in space, whatever that means, which of course literally everywhere is space. So we'll see. But I think it's about like traveling between planets and stuff. And I'm gonna sit tight on that, right? Because like Fallout 76 was such a clusterfuck.
Yep.
Of proportions. I don't know. Like it made the Cyberpunk launch look pretty smooth, to be honest. And so I know that they can like make a big game, but can they make a big game that's stable and has that like longevity and doesn't have all kinds of other weird shit going on with it, like what happened with Fallout 76? I'm just gonna wait and see what the response is from people before I jump in. Because I'm medium on it. And so like it's all about what capabilities your studio has developed over time, what your reputation is, what do people expect from you, right? And I think like Baldur's Gate 3 is exactly the kind of thing that I would expect to come from Larian Studios, given what they've achieved in the past and given every other constraint they had. Will Larian make Baldur's Gate 4? I think it would be kind of crazy for them not to, given how successful it's been. And again, like we'll expect Baldur's Gate 4 to be Baldur's Gate 3 plus 10%. Yep. Like it's still going to be like a bit bigger, a bit better, a bit more evolved. And they're just going to keep building on the same engine and the same formula. And that's what allows them to refine it because they don't have to reinvent everything every time, right?
And will be the case that, coming off of this very successful game launch, this very successful RPG launch, that a game like Starfield, if it comes out with fuckloads of bugs, with very limited repercussions for the choices you make, etc., that there is a additional comparison point that people
Starfield will be compared to Baldur's Gate for sure.
100%.
They're both RPGs from giant studios coming out right around the same time.
But I think importantly, provided that Starfield offers something very different, which it will, because it's not turn-based combat. It's not doing the same things. for the most
And it's
part,
in space.
yeah, and it's in space. For the most part, those comparisons will be largely kind of armchair comparisons, right? Oh, Baldur's Gate launched without any bugs. And Starfield's buggy as fuck. It doesn't matter because I can't have the Starfield experience in Baldur's Gate because the Starfield experience is something completely different. And I think this is the thing I would hone in on, which is like, as long as the thing you're making is meaningfully different from other stuff, meaningfully interesting, it's fine. It might be the case that you cannot do QA, right? Maybe you got some extra bugs in there, more so than someone else. But again, we've all played games with real shitty stuff going on, disconnects, just controls that are jank, whatever else, that are fun enough that it doesn't truly, it matters in like a high level kind of potentially capping out your audience sort of a way, but it doesn't matter in the fact that you've achieved success, or rather you're achieving your success despite these things being present, right?
Yeah.
And that is always possible. So
I wonder if just a lot of this sort of fear is really just a consequence of people being very exposed to the worst of the gaming community, right? Because like there's a reason this discourse is happening on Twitter, right? Which is that's where discourse happens, right? That's where
I don't know if it's discourse, but
well, yeah, I mean capital D discourse, because it's actually like on Twitter people call it the discourse, but what they mean is not discourse. They like.
Yeah,
it's like the community term for absurdist kinds of discussions that focus on some topic, right?
Twitter is just like the outrage fountain that you can go get a sip from if you want to walk away.
Well, but it's also, but it also just like the people who go out of their way to like go talk to developers, right, and say like, "Hey, I don't like what you did here," right, and that kind of stuff, right? They're enabled to do that on a platform designed like that, right? And so, because if you look at like that original tweet that you described, like that was just a statement of fact, which is like it's a completely fair thing to say, right? Which is like it's basically him observing like, hey, the bar seems to have been like dramatically raised for like what games can be by this game, right?
Yeah,
because I know because that guy's a big presence on Twitter in the game space, and so he's chronically exposed to gamer takes, right? And we see this like even in our own Discord. We'll have people pop in every once in a while and just say some just really dumb, uninformed thing about like, why can't you just do X, right? And the answer is always some combination of we don't want to, it doesn't make sense, we can't. Like it's going to be one of those things, right? Mm-hmm. But the amount of belligerence that can sometimes come into that, even when it's like just our small game company, we have a very friendly community. It's like we try to design everything to cut that stuff out and also to limit our own exposure to it. Like we don't really have a way where just like random gamers could just like come up and just yell at us for stuff, right? And so, and despite that, we still get like hit by it periodically, right? And so if you're really well known in the game space and you're working on a title and you're using these platforms to try to drive awareness of that game and all this kind of stuff, right? You're basically putting yourself in a position where just the loudest and most difficult of the gamer community could just go talk to you, right? And it is true that there's a subset of the community who like every time a new milestone is hit in like the game space, they're just like now mad at everybody else that doesn't do it. Right. Yeah. And they're very vocal about it. So I think there is like there's some truth.
I just don't believe that. Like, I mean, I understand like they're posting things on Twitter explaining how upset they are about it. I can't believe that people are actually mad. Like, well, it doesn't
matter if they're actually mad. What matters is the impact on you when they come yell at you, right?
Yeah. Well, that's why I'm not on Twitter. And you know.
It's not a psychologically safe space to be, right? But so, which is all to say, like I think like the fear and concern are found, and it's also true for publishers, right? Because anytime,
that's also true.
There's a subset of people who don't have enough nuanced thinking, right? And I think the discussion that we're talking about so far is focused on like, your average player, the people who actually buy the games, right? None of this matters because it's like every game is different. They just like meet it where it is, and that's that. And they're going to be mad like if it's a buggy mess, right? But it's not because Baldur's Gate wasn't and this one is. They're just mad because it's a buggy mess, you know? Yeah. And that's like the real world, like average experience, right? But when you're going out and interfacing with publishers and very vocal gamers and press and all this kind of stuff. Like everybody's trying to find that angle, right? And there's a lot of people who have very non-nuanced thinking, and it is the case because there was a joke also when some other I saw some people joking about when Tears of the Kingdom came out. And Tears of the Kingdom did some really incredible feats of engineering, right? Like, and their whole like building system where you can like kind of stick anything on anything, and somehow it turns into a magic robot that can just do stuff, right? Like truly incredible stuff, right? And I just saw some jokes about people being like, "Oh, our product manager comes in the next day and is like, so how do we do this, right? And like, or just like, let's do this, right?" And while it is just the case that like most teams could not pull something like that off, the vast majority of teams cannot pull something like that off, right? But that doesn't stop people in certain positions from now trying to force the issue or being mad that we can't or whatever, right? So I think on the one hand, there's a genuine. I think just all these things are true. I think like the best response to this is the real one, which is it's really cool to see people accomplish new stuff, and that also gives you fuel to both drive sort of what you now think about doing because it creates a possibility, but also you then can go study and be like, how the fuck did they pull this off? Can we learn something from this to apply to our own things, right? And so for the most part, really these things are just interesting opportunities and things to celebrate. But they do have these broader, weirder kinds of consequences in various parts of the non-nuanced parts of the industry. And sometimes people interface with the non-nuanced parts, right? And like, we're really lucky because we've managed to build a company and interact only with publishers and business partners who have nuance to their thinking, right? Mm-hmm. So that we don't fall into the kinds of traps that can get generated by just the existence of something good. Right?
Well, it's when you've got too deep of a hierarchy in your company, right? Where you've got like people making decisions about the game who are very far from the game itself, right? So like one of the comments made in this thread by Xavier Nelson Jr. was that he's worried that studios will attempt to do what Baldur's Gate 3 did, and those studios will die.
Yeah, and right. He's right, because people at the top are going to try to make that happen, but they won't understand how it was pulled off.
But it's not uniquely right.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not about Baldur's Gate 3. Like, yeah, exactly. It's always been the case that, somebody who shouldn't be making a decision about the game will come in and say, we're going to do this now, and it doesn't work with the game, and then it blows out of scope, and then the project gets canceled. Like, that happens every week.
Yeah, you don't need to industry. You don't need to be inspired by anything new to do that. That's very easy to do.
But my suspicion is that people who have like experienced this before probably just had this exact experience where like, a new game came out. It did this incredible thing, and then all of a sudden, management was like, "Now we're doing that thing," and then they destroy the company, right?
Yeah.
My bet is there's a subset of developers who aren't running their own studios, right? Who are moving between
who have
studios,
experienced
right?
that before.
Who have experienced that before, and they're looking at this thing being like, just like when Tears of the Kingdom came out, and the joke was like, "Oh, now tomorrow everybody has to figure out rigid body physics." Right? Like that's going to be. I think there's a segment of the industry who just does actually get exposed to the negative consequences of these things.
Well, one perk though of this is like, because in Tears of the Kingdom, you can look at that one concept of like the wacky, like sticking stuff together with physics, and you can kind of like in your mind isolate that from the game and try to think about ways to use that kind of a thing in another context. Mm-hmm. At Baldur's Gate 3, there's not like a mechanic that
it's just like a scale.
It's just, hey, this game is really, really fucking big, right? Yeah. So you can't have a project manager come in and be like, hey guys, can we just have our game be like 30 times bigger? That's not like a feature or a mechanic. That's just a scope.
That's true.
That's all it is, a scope.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was saying most of what is so novel about Baldur's Gate is just the coverage for like that combinatorial complexity thing, right? And it's but largely delivered through writing, right? It's all story complexity in terms of like it's very interesting, and then you have mechanical supports for it, of course, like being able to talk to the dead or whatever. But you could talk to the dead, and in a lot of different games, you could have a whole game about talking to the dead. That's like a thing you do. But does it result in combinatorial complexity that gets accounted for is a whole other question.
Yeah, what I would have they put anything out, any like talks or anything about how they did their content management and QA?
I haven't seen anything, but that is what I'm very curious
about. Because that's what I want to know about is how the fuck did they do that? Because we're already worried about because we're now starting the content push, right? So we're going to start dealing with the combinatorial complexity of content. And we already were to an extent, right? But it's gonna ramp up
just
a
mounts.
lot because like Crashlands 2 is supposed to be similarly something where like there's at any given moment there's not a specific combination of like variable values that we know you're going to end up having, right? So that's what we mean by control complexity is that at any given moment in the game, like the total game state you end up with is very
unique.
It's very unique. It's not like it looks like anybody else's, even though you're having tons of the same specific experiences, right? The shape of how that all comes together is very different. And so figuring out how to account for that in our tooling for our content pipeline is already this enormous challenge of like, how do we know that when you get to this point, like what do we need to take into account that you might have already done or seen or whatever, right? Like it's already this huge challenge. And we only have basically like 2 people deciding what the content is really, right? Like putting the content in the game. Imagine being Larian and having probably 50 people or 100 people making content.
How even just the testing, I don't know.
Yeah, and then they got to test the shit out of it. Yeah. So I would, and this is the kind of stuff where it's like, to me, these are such fascinating opportunities because I think it is good that these things push the bar up, right? And as a bar of like what's possible, I think that's excellent because again, the reality is that doesn't mean all games have to meet that bar. It means that now there's new stuff that can happen, but it also does mean that to an extent that like expectations for certain things do go up, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the one thing that I think is good that kind of comes out of this as like a new expectation is that the idea that a really big studio with a lot of resources making a really big game
not full of holes.
should also be able to release a relatively low bug game, right? And I think that's something that we've seen in the industry it feels like it's been getting worse actually instead of better.
Definitely.
And
having Pokemon last year was a garbage
shit show. Yeah.
I was like, really?
Well, I will say though too, like so Larian, like they were in early access for 3 years to get bugs out, and then in the past week they've released several hot fixes, both of which have been like, oh yeah, we fixed like 400 more crashes. Right? Right. It's like it's not that the game is bug free; it's just that it's because there is no such thing, right? No. But it is so big, and the bugs are such edge cases because they've done so much testing on it that any given player will probably not ever experience a bug, or at worst a crash, right?
Yep.
So,
well, I think it's one of the because I actually haven't played it at all. I've just like watched. So my wife's been playing it a bunch. I've heard you guys talking about it. I've seen lots of stuff, people talking about it. I've seen lots of videos on TikTok of like little things happening. You know, what I have not heard even for one breath of somebody talking about is anything related to bugs in the game. Right? It may be bug riddled for all I know, but if so, it's in a way that doesn't actually matter to the gameplay experience, right? But if you compare that to any other recent large game launch.
And we just talked about Kerbal Space Program 2, last week, where it was completely obliterated by just the volume of bugs and the lack of content after about the same time in development, actually. It was supposed to launch in 2020, got delayed after 3 years of dev, got delayed for 3 more years, and it launched with very few features and way more bugs than features. So, it's all about like, it sucks to be held to a high standard, but only in the sense that it's a lot of work, right? But to me, like the high standard of like deliver a polished product that delivers on the promise that is largely free of bugs. Like to me, that's the minimum.
Yeah,
that's not like some new bar.
Yeah, exactly. That's where it always has been. But I think what AAA studio like heads have been kind of claiming recently is that as the scale of the games they release, well, of course, which they're deciding to do, but as the scale of the games that they release goes up, that just means that it has to be buggier and there have to be more problems, and all this kind of stuff, right? That's been kind of like what the messaging has been from people running these companies. And so having somebody come out with this level of scale and quality, and also quality not just of the game, but of the overall experience, right? Mm-hmm. Is, I think, a good thing for what it signals to the rest of that part of the industry, the segment of the industry where they're throwing 500 people at a project, right?
And honestly, like something I want to do, because you can play it multiplayer. And I literally have no fucking idea how that would possibly work. And this is something we ran into when we were starting Crashlands 2, because we're like, we want a story-driven game, but we want multiplayer. How the fuck does that go, well, maybe we'll get some answers. Cause like, the three of us could go start a Baldur's Gate 3 online campaign together.
Somehow. I don't know.
Again, like, I don't know how that
is it split screen or like,
no, it's online.
We're all just different people doing our own parts of the world doing stuff.
I don't know. Because when you're playing single player, it's a party game. It's turn based, right? And it's like you have your group and your party travels together. I don't know in multiplayer, can we split off and go to different parts of the world? Like what happens if Sam starts talking to a character in a town and he's like in a cutscene talking to his character? Like, do we all see it? Yep. Or if I ran to the other side of the universe, are we tethered together? I don't know. Like, it's all very weird. And like, there were all these logistics problems that we had when we were trying to figure out how to make stuff make sense story-wise in Crashlands 2 with multiplayer. And the design problems were so intractable. It's not that we couldn't solve them. It's just that we have a limited time frame and a limited number of people. And we were like, this is too much.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to strip this out and simplify.
That's a good idea.
What we know.
Looking at it for a source of potential multiplayer solution for a later Crashlands game.
Yeah, and there's going to be like a trillion things that they do that you'll only see them if you're really looking for them when it comes to like how they handle multiplayer stuff. Because for people who are playing it just for fun and not for research purposes, like we probably would be, you would like things will probably just work smooth, and you'd be like, oh yeah, like let's go over here and do this, let's go do that, and you're not really going to notice all the weird shit that's happening to make the story actually make sense and work with your multiplayer shenanigans.
Yeah, well, there's also probably going to be some level of jank to that experience because there always is, right? But because like anytime I'm playing a game with like my wife or something, right? Then so much of what we're doing in a multiplayer game is just talking, is like collaboratively figuring out what the jank is and how to work around it, for like any given game, and so I think everybody just kind of does this as part of like what the gameplay experience is. But if you do it as a research thing, it's just such a different thing because now you're not sort of almost subconsciously just like working through the jank so that you can have the intended gameplay experience, right?
You're trying to look at it and be like,
but you're trying to look right at it and be like, why is it like this though, right? And it's also so much of our discussions were this question of like, if we did it this way, here's what the jank would be, right? Yeah. If we did it that way, here's what the jank would be, and so on, right? And one of the things that you really can't predict very well is if the jank is an acceptable trade-off, right, for the player. Because you're looking at it and like you're looking right at it's looking you right in the eye, and you're like, this is bad though. Like this is not a good this side effect, like this negative consequence of us doing it this way. Like we don't want that, but there's no way around it. But does it matter?
Doesn't
right?
matter. Yep.
And
it's tricky.
And that one,
especially in the multiplayer land where when you're doing that kind of thing, because of its impact on the design, basically the cost of getting it to the point where you could really test that question is so fucking high that you had
to change the whole design to accommodate that in the first place, right? And then build it and then find out, and I think that's true. That's basically why we kind of dropped the possibility, because multiplayer is hard on a lot of dimensions. It's technically very challenging, but the impact on design is just so huge and changes everything. And like we had a whole bunch of designs for like ways we could handle it, right? None of them were just the straightforward single player design we have today, right? And by straightforward, I mean still really complicated. There's still a lot going on, right? But we didn't have to deal with the question of, oh shit, what happens when somebody else does this other thing, right?
There's just easy stuff, easy questions, but hard answers. Like, what happens if I'm on one side of the planet and you're on the other side of the planet, and you complete a quest that gives an important item that I need? Is the quest done for me? Do I have the item? Do we share the inventory? If we share inventory, can I take the item and do something with it? And now you can't get it because I took it and put it somewhere.
And I think the main way it would have to work.
It's just so complicated.
And I can see why it would work in something like Baldur's Gate, at least based on what people have said about it. Because the design is meant to be like you're interacting with a world that is changing as you interact with it. And because like it's all about kind of like what choices you make, right? Which means there's nothing you have to do, right? Like there's nothing that you specifically have to do, which means somebody else could go do something and the world now changes, right?
Well, mainly what I was going to say, which is that it's not a single person point of view game. You can take control of any of the other characters. You have 4 characters in your party. So like you basically have built in people who could be controlled, who are already fully voiced, who are already doing, like you could already do all these things with them just solo. And then my assumption is that that's how it works, but we should definitely give that a try and see kind of how they.
I'm very intrigued. All right, let's get into a question before we round off the episode.
Let's go.
This question comes from John Flavin, who asks, have y'all ever gotten really into some specialized branch of food? Like bread baking, beer brewing, coffee roasting, or pickling. I flirted with these hobbies before, but the fun of making these things gets deflated once I realize I have to eat it all before it goes bad.
So true. So true. Yeah, this is a common problem with like a baking hobby. I really like baking, but similarly, the problem is if every time you bake something, you eat all of it, then it's
over.
Yeah, you got the beans.
That's a good way to cut your baking hobby short.
Yeah, you're dead, So
along with all your other hobbies.
The way I started doing it was when I baked stuff, then I would just go give it to neighbors, which worked pretty good because then you just make all your neighbors, humongous, slow them down. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and then you can outrun them when the bears come.
Yeah, I live in a bear. It's a very good strat overall. So I think the giving approach is good, but then you do have to ask the question like, how many people can I rotate giving pickles to? Because if you just John,
some of them are a little more challenging.
Every time you show up, you're like, hey, I got another jar of pickles for you. These are pickled bananas. I'd be like, why? Why have you done this to me yet again?
Yeah.
So,
but if it is baked goods, easiest hobby to offload onto other people, definitely.
Yep. Baked goods good.
That's why I think bread is a good one because you like, for example, I have toast for breakfast every morning. I have peanut butter on toast, right? It's like if I bake a couple loaves of bread, then I can just use that for my breakfast. I don't have to like eat it in addition. Like if you make a bunch of cupcakes, that's not normally part of your diet. So I think maybe a good move is like, hey, identify something that you do consume a lot, right? That you normally buy or whatever. And hummus, same thing. Like I learned how to make hummus because I was buying so much hummus. I'm like, man, I should probably just try to make this. So, most Sundays, I'll just make like maybe like a third of a gallon of hummus. I make a lot of hummus.
Started your own hummus factory.
I don't know if it's enough to fill this kind of a container. I obviously, I'm showing it to Adam and Sam, but it's just like a big ass Tupperware thing. So like find something that you really like and that you normally eat a lot of.
Yeah, it's already integrated into your.
Yeah, the problem is if this is an ADHD driven hobby, then you don't get to choose.
That's true.
That's true. But at that point, you don't even talk about it. Just do stuff.
Just do stuff. You'll stop doing it in a few weeks anyway.
So. Yeah. I think the hardest thing I had with the baking was actually just that a fresh loaf of bread.
Oh yeah, I got to eat that up.
So I made I won't call it a mistake, but I made a decision that had consequences. So it was I think it was 2 Sundays ago. I was like, I'm chilling. It's a relaxing Sunday. I'm gonna make some bread. I'm making the bread, and then like Sam and I are like doing movie night and stuff. I'm like, I'm gonna have a gummy. So I have a weed gummy. And man, let me tell you,
tastiest bread you've ever eaten.
If you are high on weed as you pull a fresh loaf of bread out of the oven,
oh man,
that loaf of bread is not going to fucking make it through the night. Okay,
it must have been so good. I've been saying, it's umami. It's like umami flavor. It's like umami, salty and fatty.
Anything savory,
are just so much.
Did you end up eating the whole loaf?
Oh yeah, Sam and I ate the whole fucking loaf. Mostly me,
Well, just because even like without throwing weed into the mix, like there was because my wife has lots of ADHD driven hobbies, so they just they kind of come and go. For a long time they were food related, so I kind of had to. I got the second hand side of this problem, which for me was just great because it was just like interesting, tasty things all the time.
So often, so you're just getting pelted with macaroons.
Yeah, it wasn't healthy necessarily, but it was amazing. But it was definitely the case that bread was that thing though. That anytime fresh bread came out, the two of us it was just gone. It never lasted more than 2 days. Usually just hours. It's just so good.
Sam and I are always laughing because where people talk about like what's your favorite food, and what's your favorite place to eat, blah, blah, blah. And for both of us, we're just like bread. Best food in the fucking world.
If you haven't, bread. I think if you haven't baked your own loaf of bread and like pulled it out of the oven, and then been able to eat
and then ripped it apart with your bare hands.
I do think there is sort of a godliness in that whole moment, that whole experience that is just, I
Even
don't know.
with pretty medium bread, you know?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be great, but fresh out of the oven. That's the
fresh
important
out of the
part.
oven. So good.
Oh my God.
And you can kind of emulate that. Like even if you still have the same loaf a couple days later, just throw that loaf in the microwave for just like 20 seconds, and it gets like hot and steamy and soft inside,
Yep.
and then boom.
Yeah, you can also just like
Emulated
run
loaf of
water.
bread.
You can just run water over it and throw it in the oven for a little bit too.
Yeah.
Just
Run
like
water over your loaf of bread.
yeah, it basically softens the crust back up and then lets you put more moisture.
So you
back
probably
into
want to, if you've already cut into it, you probably would like protect.
protect that side definitely. Yeah,
That's like, you know what? That's not good. Yeah. So I mean, make bread.
Yeah.
Fuck all the other stuff. Don't do beer. Don't do beer. If you drink it freshly after it was brewed, that's still like a month after you started brewing. So it's not like it's not like
fresh
it's coming
exactly.
out. Yeah, and also like you want it to be cold. So then like after it's brewed, you got to refrigerate it, and it's not really going to be that much different than
Yeah.
Yeah,
You already
if
have
you
to wait
can
a little bit
choose.
for bread.
Yeah, if you can choose bread, I think is a good choice.
Yep.
Easy to offload if you make too much because everybody else also will just devour fresh bread. You know,
Man. Yeah. If you give fresh bread to a neighbor, you got
got a friend for
you're
life.
good. You got a
it's
friend
kind
for
of
life.
like you ever hear stories about people like giving stuff to crows and making a crow army.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Every animal also loves bread. Every animal.
Yes.
Yeah, you can make your own people army with bread. You know,
Yeah.
just
And then also an
bread
animal.
to all your neighbors.
Yeah, I was like, also a crow army if you want. You
Yeah.
know.
Raccoons. Just
Turkeys.
anything.
There's a reason why
My
you know
cats
they
eat
said.
bread if they can get a hold of it. You know, like yeah.
Was it the Romans who said like if you want to control the population, you need bread and circuses, right? It's like mostly bread though.
Yeah, I don't even
Mostly
Yeah. Give me just the bread. I don't really give a fuck about the other stuff. But yeah, give me lots of fresh baked bread. I'll do whatever you need. I'll kill whoever you want and just point me in that direction, you know? I'll be a good soldier.
Yep. We'll overthrow
right, well, that's all the
empires
time
for
we
a loaf
have.
of bread. That's one of those signs you see on the side of a bread.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fuck yeah. Bread's the best. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. We'd also like to remind you to head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list if you haven't done so already. It helps boost it up the algorithmic charts, and it helps us out in the long run, so we'd appreciate that. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye.